So I thought I would try something different today. Rather than using the web camera like I normally would to record, I'm going to be using my phone to see if that gets you guys a higher quality video. If you think that this video works better than my web camera, please let me know, and I will invest in more equipment to hold the camera more stable, so that way you guys can get the best video possible. First and foremost, I am still working on the lighting tutorial video that I promised a while back. And those who don't know about that, I am in the works of currently working on a object source lighting video to teach you how I do object source lighting, as many of you have seen through many of my commissions. I have a very specific style and way that I do it, which is different from most. And although that's not necessarily the right way, it is a stylized way that people seem to enjoy. So keep an eye out on the horizon for that video coming soon. I really just wanted to get in and make a video because I haven't made one in a while, and I thought a really easy video would be to just go ahead and mash out these two TIE fighters. Typically this one is known as Darth Vaders TIE fighter, although it doesn't necessarily have to belong to Vader himself. And then just a stereotypical TIE fighter here. I have started out by priming both of these in Mechanicus Standard Gray. So pretty typically I would be using a pallid witch flesh, but today I'm going to be using white scars. My pallid witch flesh has died. You can kind of see here that the pallid witch flesh has more of a cream color to it. And I could probably mix this up, adding a little Aberland Sunset or perhaps just a tiny amount of Deepkin flesh. But I think the straight white will work just fine. We want to load our brush up. I always get a little extra on the palette, and then we are going to get most of this off to do a good heavy dry brush. And I'm just gonna kind of dust the surface. So you can see here, that's way too heavy, which is fine. I started on the engine bay because I plan to cover the exhaust of the engine bay in a different color. And I'm using this more like an edge highlight than a typical dry brush would normally be used. We're basically overbrushing right now, just trying to get a nice even white across the surface here. Again, we're not too concerned about those solar panels. We're just trying to get all of these edges. I am going to be dry brushing almost as if this model had a grain. As you can see here, I'm pulling my brush in toward the cockpit window, and I'm pulling it in toward the exhaust. And that is just so that any scrapes or scratches we decide to add in the weathering process will be aided by this to give the look as though it's been traveling through space. We're gonna hit our palette again, kind of load up our brush, mash it in there real good, get the majority of it back off. Again, test it out on the aft of the ship. Realize that we're just a little too heavy still. And then we're just gonna get in there, and like you can see, I'm streaking with my dry brush. I'm pulling toward the aft of the ship, and if I come around, I'm pulling toward the cockpit. And that is what's gonna give us this aided look as though it's been traveling through space, as opposed to just being dry brushed in random directions here. So forward to back motions, not side to side. Make sure we get that nice stark outline along the edge. Now this is not meant to be a screen accurate or a movie accurate paint job. This is meant to be a looks good to the eye paint job. This is how I do all of my Star Wars models. I really enjoy how they turn out when they're painted like this. And if you've seen any of my Star Wars related work before, this is how I have painted all of those other ships, including the Millennium Falcon, which I actually have acquired a second Millennium Falcon, so we'll be doing a video about that hopefully soon. All right, and now that I've done some final touch-ups on the models, gotten them to the point where I would like them, we are going to be starting out with Abaddon Black, and we will be using roughly about a 2-to-1, 1 part Abaddon to about 2 parts Incubi Darkness. And you're gonna want to kind of water this down fairly heavily. Again, we want this to act more like a thick wash as opposed to an actual paint. And the reason we're adding the Incubi Darkness as opposed to just using either straight black or the straight Incubi Darkness with no black, I want there to be a bit of color. I want this to be really dark, but I want there to be a bit of color. With spaceships, especially Star Wars ships, let's be honest, about 80 to 90% of the ship is different shades of gray and or black. And adding color wherever we can is fairly important. As you can see there, it paints on like a paint. So we still need to go ahead and add a bit more water and just kind of knock this down to a semi-translucent point. And as you can probably see there on the edge of my finger, there is that translucency I'm looking for. What that's going to allow is that as we paint it into the model here, and we just kind of mark out all these little solar panels with this heavily diluted, near wash, near glaze type consistency paint, it is just gonna soak right in to all these little nooks and crannies, and it's gonna leave all the high spots. And then what we can do after this is we can hit this with a black wash, which will knock it down that last layer from this green color to a black. And that green will be there, but as an undertone. And that undertone will do so much work for you as a painter that you wouldn't even believe. So we're just gonna go ahead and mark all of this in. There's nothing wrong with a little accident here or a little accident there. We all make mistakes, especially if you're new to the hobby and you're still learning. All right guys, so here we are. It's still drying a little bit, but I want to move on to the next step. There's no black wash on this yet. However, I wanted to go ahead and do the Darth Vader tie with a black wash. Mostly because I want to show the differences between using that light green undertone prior to the wash phase and then just using this straight. Now all of this splotching where we've overbrushed with the gray is going to show up with this black wash. None of that's going to get hidden, which it would have been hidden with using that green layer. So that splotching will look like discoloration, which will probably lend well to what it is. My understanding is the actual TIE fighters have a blue tinge to the solar panels from the photos that I can find. And maybe finishing this guy off with a blue wash on top of the black will get us there. But yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know what my plan is moving forward with this model, which is why this one will have solar panels that look slightly different from the other ones. But I figured this would be a good way to show you, how underbrushing or underpainting looks and why the undercoats and such are so important. So here we can kind of get a side-by-side difference in color. This is with the green undertone, this is just with straight black washes, and although things look a little glossy now, that will dull out once we put in a dull coat. But now I just want to talk about adding little details and things through some basic weathering, which we're actually going to be able to apply with a panel line. This is accent colored dark gray. It's gonna look pretty similar to that original gray we started with, but it will be just slightly darker. This almost comes out almost as a blackish kind of panel line color when it's all said and done. Hydrophobic, and it flows across the surface. But we just want to go in, and anywhere there's little detail bits, as you can see, it just kind of flows into the recesses and goes across the surface really smoothly. And we're just trying to add in a little depth around all these little greeblies, fill in any small holes. Don't be afraid to go ahead and dip back in and get some more. You can make this basically with just like paint and dish soap. It does kind of work the same. I'm always of the opinion though that if you can afford to buy a product that does it for you, then there's no point in you wasting your time to build that product unless you need it in bulk. So this is definitely something that is on my recommended purchase list. And we want to make sure we get those same details in on the other side once again. If there's certain panels that we feel should be slightly darker, along with a black wash, you could do this or just the straight black wash and darken up a few panels. So for instance, I'm just going to give this one a light coating and kind of knock down that starkness from the dry brush. Again here, we're skipping the one in the middle and just knocking that down a little bit. Edge highlighting will also go a long way here. So we're going to come back in with some grays and some whites and pick out some of these panels and edge highlight some of these bits a bit more, but we need to let this dry because that does take almost no time at all to dry, but it does also need to cure so it stays on. Okay, so as I stated before, we're going to be using Dawnstone, going to be using Scavenger Blight Dinge, and we're going to be actually using Fenrisian Gray, and we are going to do some very mild, very light body panel color changes using washes made of these three colors. Now, this will be used as a highlight color for these two. I am not going to use this straight blue on its own. However, a technique that I wanted to go over and discuss is actually a technique I've been using for a while. Now, there are plenty of videos out there on how to make a wash. I am not going to really bother showing you guys how to do that unless you really want me to, as there's plenty of sources out there other than myself who can give you a much better idea of how to do that. However, something that I've not seen a lot of, once you've loaded your brush up with a wash, if you just touch it to a paper towel and you can see how it soaks all of that moisture out of the brush, there is still paint in here. And you can do this with almost any wash. And, sorry about that, you can go in to any one of these body panels and paint directly with a wash. And although you may not have the best time seen on camera, there is a color difference here between that darker mechanical gray that is underneath and the gray I am painting on top. And we are just gonna very lightly pick out some of these panels and brighten them up and darken up others. Just have fun with this step and tell your own story with it. And I promise you won't be disappointed when you're done. It's important to not use a white color during this stage, as we'll be using white as an edge highlight to add more stark contrast here in a moment. So don't worry about white, just leave white out of the mixture and we will handle it soon enough. Just remember, the concentration of color with a wash is going to be where your brush ends. So just keep that in mind when picking out all these locations for these newfound body panel highlights. You don't have to perfectly cover up a panel either. You can leave it as a partial cover and just kind of blend those colors together. There we go. So that's one layer done. Now let's come in with a darker color. And again, you don't need tons of this paint. You don't need tons of it at all. You just need a bit of water, a bit of paint, and a little bit of patience. And again, bleed that color out onto a paper towel. And let's just go in and pick out some body panels. Now this Scavenge Blight is just going to darken. I don't expect it to be as stark of a difference in color as the previous layer was. But it also should help to smooth out some of the scrape marks that we did with the dry brushing earlier. Maybe add a little bit of staining in places. Who knows what kinds of spaceship fuel they're using, although with Star Wars, I'm sure it's pretty easy to find out. We're not needing to go too crazy with that stage. We're going to add just a little bit of this blue color to the original gray that we were doing our highlights with. Come into some of these oddball places where you maybe want this to look like a bit of a futuristic metal. We don't know necessarily what, these metals are. Sure, they've got, fantastic mythical names, but we don't know how heat affects them. We don't know how being exposed to a lack of oxygen affects them. And there we have it. So, that's all of those little body panels picked out and done. I am going to do that on this other TIE fighter, and then we'll cut back to a final dry brush, and then we can work on painting these cockpits. But this time we are going way lighter than anything that we have done previously. So I'm just mashing the paint into the bristles. You can see we got quite a bit on there. And then you're just gonna work it into the paper towel until there's almost nothing left at all. So we're just gonna go ahead and give it a nice little white, light dry brush. And this is very light pressure this time, guys. We aren't going super heavy for the sake of weathering. We're just trying to catch the edges. I'm not really gonna go crazy with trying to dry brush anything other than these central hubs. As you can see, I'm not even really getting in there outside of using the corners of the brush. And we'll just give it a once over the cockpit to bring out those lines real good. Make sure the cockpit hatch is hit up real good. And we're pretty much done there. Again, we're just gonna bring some of these streaky lines back into this model. Give a nice overbrush to the front all these little greebly details. And then I don't like how soft the edge highlight got, so I'm just going to dry brush the edge highlight back in all around these wings. That's not super diluted, that's not super thick, it's just somewhere in between. And so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna really lightly go in and make sure that some of these edges become more defined. So that way they really pop in contrast versus everything else that's on the model. Give something for your eye to focus on so it's not just one amorphous gray blob. If we didn't have the wings on here, you could probably get your brush at a nice angle to be able to hit both of those edges at once. But for now, we're not really worried about getting fancy. We just want to get it done. Yeah, see, we can get both of those fairly decent. We just want to add a little bit of an edge back to those. And a little bit of an edge back to those. Little shoots that come off of the bottom hatch plate here. Make sure that gets a little bit there, and we'll just hit the leading edge with a bit of white. Give a little sharp highlight onto that. A little sharp highlight onto that. I am going to paint the guns on both TIE fighters with solid black. But again, just make sure that leading edge and that leading edge. And unlike the last one, we want to make sure that we get this preceding edge and this preceding edge. We'll also be painting the exhaust with black. So I want to go ahead and on these little bits here, just get a nice bright highlight so that it accents that exhaust. But we want to just take a tiny bit of white, and let me make sure you can see that. Right here on this inside edge, just want to cut that edge and that edge on all four sides here on the front as well as on the back. That is going to help to break up this gray shape, and whether you realize that white's there or not down the road, it's still breaking up the shape enough that your eyes are able to better tell the difference between all the shapes there, because they're all basically the same shade of gray. We can make this one just a little starker. And we're looking pretty good at this point. So I think it's time to go ahead and paint these guns and move on to the cockpit. Again, we're gonna paint that canopy up with a bit of a faint glow. We're gonna paint these guns up real quick though and knock those out of the way. I want these to be solid black. There is some spots where a little bit of that gray is showing through. This black is semi-translucent. That is absolutely fine. What that's going to do is it's going to make this black look more like canopy glass as opposed to just looking like a solid object, because it's going to look as though it's reflecting something outside the canopy or perhaps reflecting something from inside the canopy, and that is absolutely fine. Now, I was inspired by, there is a guy who has done an animated series on Star Wars from the Empire's point of view, and the insides of the cockpits are dependent upon which ship you're flying, greens and reds. I really like the idea of a red cockpit. However, I am gonna go with greens just because I think that the green will be a bit more traditional looking. This first section now, you do want to treat this a bit like a wash. So it's fine if it's a little wet like it is now, but what you want to do is you want to find the top of the TIE Fighter and the bottommost recess from where you want the light source to be will be the darkest. So these upper panels are almost entirely going to be completely coated in this green effect. So we're gonna kind of come across the front in this bit of a diagonal, and then because this is a translucent dome-like surface, we're going to catch the bottom edges on all of these panels, and that's going to make it look like the light is coming through the canopy. And then I'm going to add a bit of a curve to the central piece. Again, if it gets on the gray, just use your finger, use a clean brush, kind of wipe it down. Okay, same thing with this other one. To finish this effect off, we're gonna add, probably don't need to go all the way up to moot green, we can probably settle with a bit of warpstone glow. And this is going to be our extreme highlight. Now, this highlight does not need to be a dead-on highlight, meaning that it doesn't have to be an edge highlight. It doesn't even have to be in a straight line. The idea is that we're doing a bit of a almost non-metallic metal highlight scheme where it's reflecting things both on the inside of the cockpit as well as on the outside of the cockpit. So you want to keep this highlight in the upper ridges of the canopy. Now the lines don't have to always line up across the tops of the canopies here, and that's fine. But you want just a little bit of highlight in each canopy where you want your most extreme light to be. Again, you don't have to go crazy with this, just want a little bit. And again, the colors dry much darker than what they go on as, so you may decide that you want to add a few more layers to really build up the color that you're going for. The trick with this highlight is you don't want to cover the entire canopy like we did the last time with the previous layer. And if you do, you may want to go a step higher with a slightly brighter green on those canopies, just so that it still sells the illusion of the depth. This layering of the color is the whole thing that sells this depth illusion. And if you don't layer up this color like this, the illusion is pretty much completely broken. And so there we go. You have this semi-glossy black green that gives this awesome canopy look. We are going to go ahead and I will knock out the airbrush glow of the engine, and I will cut back with a beautiful picture of everything that's all said and done. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have ideas for future videos, feel free to leave them in the comment section below.